All right, so as Vicky has said, we're all very wet. We know that. This is my front yard at the moment at Camperdown. So obviously these spring sowing options are a little bit away in the future at the moment, but nevertheless it's good to get a bit of a plan and have a bit of a think about what we're going to do in the spring and the summer. So there's three main options. So I'll spend a little bit of time on the first two options, and then the third we'll spend quite a bit of time on. But the first one is to grow a spring grain crop. So for those of you who really love getting in the header and starting driving, this is probably the one for you. So we found out through local experience, barley and triticale to a certain extent as well yield relatively well in spring, given an average to a soft finish. Wheat is a little bit more finicky, so it will yield for you, but it does need to be a really pretty good spring, and it's a little bit of a Goldilocks when it comes to that. So your barley and your triticale are a lot more reliable options. So Southern Farming Systems trials in 2017, they've found that those longer season / more adaptable barley varieties do perform better in a spring sowing. So varieties like your Planet, which is quite adaptable, or your Oxford and Westminster, which are longer season varieties. So those three perform the best in that year, and there's local grower experience that I've called on that show those varieties do quite well in different areas of Victoria when we have the spring to pull them off. So when we are talking about a spring crop, obviously the yieldability isn't there the same as it is in an autumn sown grain crop, so we do need to keep our input costs to a minimum. So wherever you can save a few dollars and think you can get away with it, it is probably a good idea. Average yields are about 3.5 tonne, but they do vary from 2 tonne to 5. So if you operate on the fact that you're in quite a wet year like we're having, and an early sown spring barley crop, you'll probably go 2 to 3 tonne. If you can operate on that as a margin, then you're probably going to go down the right track. So keeping those input costs at a minimum will help you achieve a good gross margin. Grain obviously is not the only option. If the spring does all of a sudden peter out and we lose all this moisture that we've got at the moment, you can, obviously most of us have got livestock in the system, so we can either graze that or we can take that for silage or hay if needed, if we think the spring's not going to finish. So even though an option is to grow a spring grain crop, they are still multi-purpose. So we can use them in some way, and with silage and hay prices the way they are, everything's on the table. So the second one, as we've heard mentioned today as well, is to grow a winter crop. So winter canola and winter wheat, we've all had quite a bit of experience with them. SFS have done a lot of work with them. They've got that vernalisation gene, which means that their reproductive response is only triggered after winter. So that means you can treat them as a fodder crop in spring, and obviously if they're sown in early spring, they do get up and going really quite well. They're very tough once they're established, especially the canola has a good taproot and hangs on after grazing and comes back very well. And we have had good grower experiences with this. So gross margins vary depending on whether you keep grazing it, how much you value that grazing, whether or not you do get grazings, and then how much yieldability you get out of that winter canola. But they can really perform in our livestock cropping systems. This is actually a paddock. The sunflower obviously was my main purpose in taking the photo, but behind it, this is a Eddie Max at Repugnant over the summer. So he actually took all the summer stuff, was grazed and frosted out, and he took that Eddie Max through for an oilseed harvest, which he wasn't expecting to do. So if you can do it at Repugnant, we've got a really good chance of doing it well here. So we went through those first two options really quickly. We will spend a little bit more time on the third option because it's my favourite. So behind door number 3, most of us have these or these. And how else can we turn swans in our paddocks into really good biomass and maybe put a little bit of health back into our soil as well, and a little bit more resiliency into our systems? And the answer, for those of you who know me well, is pretty obvious. It'll be cover crops. So that to me, cover crops can be a little bit misleading. The term has come about because they cover the ground, but in our sorts of livestock-based system, you can turn cover crops into multi-species forages is really what we're looking for. So obviously there's some economic returns through animal grazing, but there's also a whole heap of soil health related benefits that we might see help us in these wet years and then in drier years. So they really do help build the resilience of our soil health, and they can help us combat weed and pest issues as well. So we'll just go quickly through the what, when and why, and how you can fit them into your system. So the first one to ask yourself, if you have got a wet paddock that's been fallow or washed out, or you just haven't got around to it, what's the goal of your fodder? So obviously you're wanting to feed livestock if you've got livestock in the system, but what are your other goals? Is that paddock compacted? Do you want to boost the nitrogen profile within that system? Do you just want to add diversity into the paddock? Do you want to smother weeds? So the goal of the paddock and what you're wanting to be doing with that paddock will help set you up in terms of choosing a fodder or a mix of species that will help you achieve that goal. Obviously, the soil and the environment plays a big part. A fodder crop or a cover crop that I'd recommend in north of the Divide is perhaps not quite the same, or definitely not quite the same as what I would recommend here. So your soil type, whether it's a free draining soil or a heavy soil or somewhere in between, and your rainfall and how much of a spring summer you have will depend what you sow, and it will help you choose the species that you do sow. So grass is obviously your big carbon source. Grasses and cereals will help you capture carbon, and they're quite aggressive at smothering weeds. Legumes obviously fix nitrogen, and our broadleaves are in there mostly to give us a big taproot and to give us some leafy, rapidly decomposing residues as well. So when? As soon as possible, not right now, but as soon as we can into fallow washed out paddocks, as soon as we can traffic those paddocks without doing a lot of damage. ASAP when pasture paddocks go to head, so I'm working with a lot of dairy farmers my way down at Camperdown and south of there, where they're direct drilling forages for summer grazing into their pasture paddocks when they've just started to go reproductive. So as soon as they start to throw up a seed head or two, that pasture is running out of puff. It's not particularly competitive, so the option then is to go straight in and sow something, and it will get established relatively effectively. After silage obviously is a good option. You've got usually a nice clean bed and a relatively good seed bed for you to go into. After hay and after grain, obviously we're going from this and we're heading towards doing something like this after hay and after grain, so that is more of an opportunistic occasion. So if we've got good subsoil moisture, if for example it was a pulse and the moisture's really hung around, or we get a really good rainfall event that's forecast, it is a really good option, and you can turn off some really good biomass grown at that time of the year, but it does depend on the season and the summer rainfall we're going to have. So this is something, these are all local photos, so this is roughly what a spring or an autumn sown, this is autumn sown, but a spring sown mix would look roughly the same because the species within it aren't temperature sensitive. So at this time of the year, or in another 3 weeks or 4 weeks when we can safely get on the paddocks, the mixes that we're going to choose need to be plants that get up and get going in the cold. So they're really what we're used to sowing in an autumn mix. Anywhere from a 3 to a 10-way blend is possible, depending on how many species you want to put in, what your budget is like, and whether you've got perhaps any farm safe seed that you can cheaply whack in there as well. But we can see broadleaves in there, the legume, we've got some vetch in there, there are some peas hidden in there but you can't quite see them, and obviously bulk cereals. So maximum ground cover, really good grazing. The farmer in question is lambing down on this at the moment, having a wonderful time. Obviously this is a spring sown mix. It was irrigated, but I don't think, possibly not going to need that this year. But this is in February, so just a monster. He actually cut that for silage, just a monster crop, and he'll end up cutting 2 lots of silage this year out of that paddock, 2 complete crops. So a really good way just to bulk up your system and get your system really productive, potentially help you build carbon with all those rich cereals. So cereals, obviously very vigorous. They get up and get going like nobody's business when we sow them, and they're quite good grazing early on. So in that tillering and vegetative stage, they're about the same as a ryegrass. It's only when they start elongating and going ahead that we see their quality really drop off, but that happens very quickly. But at that early grazing in our spring, they're really good options to finish some livestock, and they're quite cost effective. So especially if you've got some in a silo sitting around somewhere yourself, or even if you do buy it through a seed company, they are cereals are a really good way just to blanket cover a paddock mostly, with a few other additives at a relatively low cost. And they're not temperature sensitive, as I've said, so you can whack them in straight away and they'll get going for you. So millet in the spring is an option, but only really once the temperature gets to 14 degrees. So you can sneak it in earlier than that, but if they're at about 12 degrees, but if there are cold nights or cold days, it will set the millet back. Rule of thumb is about 14 degrees, it just bounces out of the ground and away it goes. So you can sneak it in a little bit earlier if you're lucky and you cross your fingers, but 14 degrees is probably a safer option. So brassicas, they're the Mr. Muscle of the fodder mix. They provide most of the protein and the energy of that mix. And these are two that I've just singled out for that spring sowing. Autumn is, you can diversify a bit, and there are other brassica options, but these are probably your two toughest spring going into summer. So tillage radish, it's quite fast out of the ground, and it does have a lovely big taproot here that you can see, and it's really good in dry seasons because of that taproot. So once it gets down into the subsoil, it will drag up nutrients and moisture from quite a long way down, and it is very tough in that summer period. So it's a good tough option. The other one is our fodder rate. We all know that your more traditional types like Winfred and Greenland are really good in dry seasons. They graze them off and they just keep coming back if they've got the moisture. So they're just two really tough options that I do like. There are turnips and other forage brassicas that you can use, but these are probably, for a spring/summer sowing, these are the two tough ones that I see. So summer options, once you hit that 16 degrees, there's a whole plethora of exotic, wonderful things that you can put in. Sorghum obviously is a bit of a mainstay. We do use it relatively often. Sunnies are a really good option, sown at a relatively low rate per hectare, just to drill another broadleaf taproot down and also give you some attraction for all your pollinators and your bugs. Corn can be really quite lucrative. This is dryland corn at Warrnambool last year, really thumping crop and quite cost effective because of the dry matter he got off that crop, but not for everyone. And then we've got our legumes, our summer active legumes, which we have varied degrees of success with, but nevertheless they are an option, plus all the spring options we've got. So if you really got carried away, you could have an enormous mix of species, but these are the ones that we generally see to a greater or lesser extent. So sorghum, just a quick recap of sorghum. Sorghum is really great, provided that you've got the moisture there. So you do have to sow it a bit later because of its soil temperature sensitivity at about that 16 degrees. But it's really water use efficient. So if it does get the rainfall, it will grow like nothing else, and does have a higher total yield than millet, which is the other main contender. But obviously, growing so rapidly, it can go rank. So if you're using it as maintenance feed, that's fantastic. Let it grow as tall as it possibly can and feed it off. But if you want it to fatten animals to a certain extent, you need to keep it quite short and manageable. That being said, you can't keep it too short because of its prussic acid risk. So it has to be 80 centimetres to a metre tall to really get out of that prussic acid zone, which is a little bit hard if you've grazed it off once already and there's not enough rainfall and it gets a bit stressed and doesn't get back to your 80 centimetres to a metre. So you do have to obey those grazing height specs, because I have seen people get away with it, but I've also seen, really negative effects, animals die and all that sort of stuff with it. So it is a good plant to use, but you do just need to be aware of how to use it. If you are a little bit wary about the straight sorghums, there are Sudan grass crosses or straight Sudans, which have half the prussic acid to no prussic acid in them if they're a straight Sudan, but they do compromise yield and vigour because they don't have that straight sorghum genotype. So they're an option, but they're slightly less vigorous and slightly less hardy in the summer as well. So this is just a little table. If you want to whip out your smartphone, Drummy's already on it, and take a photo, that's fine. This is just a really rough rule of thumb that I did the other day about when to sow. So obviously all your green blocks are roughly when you should be sowing these, or when you can sow these, given moisture and temperature and all that sort of stuff. So you can see here, cereals and stuff can still be sown in our spring, so can fodder, rape and turnips. Radish is more of a summer sowing into an autumn sowing. Millets and sorghums late in the year, early in the year, depending on what you're planning to do with that paddock, depending on the timeliness of what you need to do in the autumn, will depend when you sow those. And then obviously corn and your temperature sensitive summer legumes are in the back end of the year as well. So there's a lot of scope here between September and December, given our moisture levels now, to be able to sow something or a mix of somethings that are really quite productive. So obviously there's an economic benefit to sowing these mixes, just because of the animal grazing you can get at that pointy end of the year when all your pasture paddocks have gone off. But there are other reasons as well, so we'll just trot through these. And sheep and cattle are part of the system of trying to regenerate soils as well. So we'll just have a quick look at that. So the other benefits to putting a multi-species fodder mix in is the fact that if it's at the summer end of the year where we don't generally grow anything and our harvested paddocks are fallow, and our pasture paddocks have run out of puff and aren't really doing much, is the fact that these living roots pump in soil carbon. So soil carbon is the main driver of water holding capacity and soil health. So if we want to, A, suck out some moisture with a summer cover crop, which is quite advantageous most years here, and also build our soil moisture holding bucket to infiltrate more water and to hold more water for our crops, that those living roots are responsible for that, in a simple way. So obviously they deepen those rooting depths as well. So having living roots in the system and building that soil rooting depth will help our following crop or our following pasture. And obviously having the mulch on the surface and the roots drawing down as well will encourage our rainfall to go straight into the soil, and we'll be able to hold it much more easily. So this is a soil test out of a cover crop paddock at Birregurra, so on a pretty heavy soil type. This is a summer sown trial. So we had a small fallow area off to the side of the paddock after silage. We had a monoculture of corn, a monoculture of grazing maize, which was a BMR variety, which are sweeter and have less lignin, and then AGF's all-purpose sort of summer max blend, which just has tillage, radish, rape, sorghum and millet. So a pretty simple sort of blend, but it does have those 4 species in it, so a bit of diversity. And obviously you can see that organic carbon going up and up. So the monocultures do transmit organic carbon into that system, but the mix here did do the best job. So getting that diversity of species in just really helps the plants and just pumps more organic carbon. So there's all sorts of root physiologies within that mix. There's shallow-rooted and deep-rooted plants in that mix, all helping each other drag up nutrients and moisture. And all through summer, the cover crop, or the diverse cover crop, did look the best. So then we get to the fact that the carbon feeds our soil bugs. So we're talking about microbial activity in the middle of winter going dormant. What we want to do is in spring, obviously, they get going and they multiply and they become a pretty good population. And when that paddock goes dormant, their food source also dries up, so they start on a decline. And then in autumn, we expect them to pick up again. So we're having this peak and trough system of our soil bugs. So what we want to do with that cover crop, if we've got the moisture to sow one in spring or summer, is to make sure that it feeds our microbes, because they help drive our system as well. So this is a Vic no-till demo. So this is 2 trays of soil that had a rainfall simulation over them. The reason this one's so dark is because all the water infiltrated into it. It wasn't quite that dark. But this is a no-till cover crop paddock versus a conventionally cultivated non-cover crop paddock. So you can see that, hopefully you can see the aggregation through that and the fact that it's just gone so dark because all the moisture's sucked in. And this is relatively dry and quite slabby and all that sort of stuff. So you can see that that paddock's been cover crop for about 4 or 5 years, so there is a fair investment in time and effort into getting the soil that way. But you can see that factor of having those healthy roots in the system all the time does really give you a benefit in the long run. This is at Repugnant, probably when I took that sunflower photo. I just grabbed my soil temperature thermometer and whacked it in on bare soil versus covered soil with the mulch and the cover crop shade. And there's about a 6 or a 7 degree difference between bare soil and cover crop soil. And this wasn't a particularly hot day. For Repugnant, it was only about 35, I think. So in the heat of summer when it's 45, that difference is going to be even more extreme. So you're really helping to stabilise your bugs' environment and give them a happy sort of place to be so they don't all die. You can check whether they're actively working by pulling out a plant. So what I've got here is a sorghum plant, I believe. Might be millet, but it's probably sorghum. And all the root hairs are covered in soil. So what soil bugs do is when they're alive and functioning quite well, they exude something called glomalin, which scientists have done a bit of work on over the last couple of years. And basically it's soil glue. So what they exude around that rhizosphere and around those root hairs is glue that then binds soil and roots together. So what that marks is the start of a well-aggregated soil. So if you can picture that all the way across this paddock, there's all this soil being held together and aggregated all around your root zones, which is really what you want. So obviously if carbon feeds microbes, microbes feed the system. So they drive our nutrient cycling, our residue decomposition, all those things that help make our soil a more active, more resilient system. Obviously cycling nutrients, the nutrients become more plant available more quickly, giving us nitrogen, phosphorus and all those sorts of things when we need it. And they help prevent that lock-up or reduce that lock-up time of our nutrients when we're putting fert on. As a result, obviously they improve our plant fertility and they improve our soil fertility as well, which is the main driver of having them in there. And what this ends up doing to our system is we have more nutrient-dense food because the nutrients are more available in the soil solution and therefore to the root. We've got healthier animals, which put on weight more easily, which are more saleable, which we like probably eating. And then we've got a more resilient and a more productive soil as well. So there's all these follow-on effects from putting in something that acts for us as a fodder into getting a more resilient system that can infiltrate our moisture, not become too wet, and then give it back to us when we need it. So the last piece of the puzzle is the plants feed animals. We either eat them or we make dollars off them. So this is just down the road from my place last summer, which wasn't a particularly great summer at Camperdown. It was very dry from the end of November until the middle of Feb. But this was a spring-sown summer max paddock that my neighbour took me to because he had no idea. He was sticky-beaked over the fence. He had no idea what it was. I knew what it was. But these cattle are just waiting to get led into that, and they were strip grazed over summer, and they were very happy. So what we can do here is in that pointy end of the season when there's not a lot of green feed around, if we've got a cover crop like that compared to the paddock behind it, it really is an oasis of dollars. So that Birregurra paddock where he had the cover crop, he's a beef trader, so Angus cattle, and he pushed his steers into that 650 kilo sort of niche market, and he got a contractor to sow the seed, and the BMR maize and the corn are not inexpensive seeds, but he made a profit of 11 grand off that paddock after all the costs were done. So just by pushing those steers into that niche market. So you can obviously have a lot of weight gain per day off some high genetic cattle or sheep, and you can make a lot of profit out of it at a time of the year when you probably otherwise couldn't. So a really good opportunistic money-making scheme there. This is from a fellow down at Inverleigh. He had a twin-bearing mob of ewes. He put them on a cover crop. He had singles on a ryegrass clover pasture, and the ewes did better on the covers raising twins than the singles did on the pasture. So he gathers together heaps of info on his stud, and he was absolutely rapt when that came back. It wasn't a lot of difference, but considering twins versus singles, it was probably pretty awesome. So there's another couple at Werneth, and they reckon their land markings through scanning are up about 20% just by landing down on some some diverse cereal brassica mixes in autumn. And a lot of farmers that I'm working with now are starting to cut down on their fertiliser use. So they've had cover crops or fodders in for a couple of years now, and they're starting to just knock out some of their applications or reduce them, which obviously comes back to reducing your input costs, means your gross margin is a lot better. So a good book to get you started. This was an interesting read. It was just called Dirt to Soil. It's by Gabe Brown. He's a farmer in the US. He went from a conventional system to grazing his animals on quite a lot of cover crops. Did a really good job of explaining how and why that worked for him. So it's just a good example if you're interested of a farmer telling you what he did and why he did it.
He's on YouTube.
He is on YouTube. You can probably watch him on YouTube rather than read, but I haven't got a really good internet connection at home, so the book was easier for me. So just some take-home messages. Obviously, we've got too much moisture at the moment, but that's going to change into having a wonderful spring, hopefully. So when it rains. So this is another farmer just out of Camperdown at Garvock. That we had a dry period November to the middle of Feb, but he got 1.5 inches in the middle of Feb and whacked a tillage radish millet fodder rape mix in. This is just a straight radish paddock there, but most of the ones he did were covers. And he's just got feed for days. He just can't keep up with that because that set him up for early autumn while his pastures were getting going, and he hasn't really looked back. So he sowed when it rained, and he's reaping the rewards, and we can do that too. Plants will grow when they're sown, and those little changes matter. So sometimes in Gippsland this year there were a lot of people that just put a cover in over summer because they didn't have a lot of choice, but it didn't rain very much in Gippsland, or hasn't rained very much in Central and East Gippsland for about 3 years. So their cover crops weren't fantastic over summer, but they've really seen the differences in water infiltration and the ease of sowing their broadacre paddocks now that they've come into autumn. The below ground difference is what's really making the difference for them this year, rather than what they actually grazed off it over spring and summer. Obviously, they're not as risky because you can make dollars grazing them. So whatever comes up, if it doesn't have any animal health issues, you can just bear it off at ground level if you have to and make your dollars that way, rather than having to wait for a harvest or the potential for a silage cut. So grazing them can often be the safest and least risky option, as well as having your soil health benefits and all that sort of stuff. If you do want to get onto Twitter, or you're on Twitter already, it's a great resource for this sort of dual purpose fodder cropping sort of sector. So there's a lot of good farmers on there doing some really awesome stuff. So that's about it for me. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Dave. Obviously, a broad overview of what we may or may not be able to do. Questions?
So if you have a cover crop over summer,
yes,
when you come to next autumn and you're wanting to get your broadacre crop back in,
yes,
how do you then manage that?
So it depends a little bit on your level of grazing. So your temperature sensitive summer stuff like your millets and sorghums and corn will frost out. You can weaken them dramatically by grazing them. Often overgrazing right at the pointy end of summer when you're going into autumn will help knock out your cover crop, and that's effective in a lot of cases, or you'll just have to take it out with a spray. But I'd try your grazing first because that's going to be best for you economically. But either grazing, weakening it and then spraying, or grazing will often do the trick.
And those examples that you gave, do they rely on like cell grazing or that really high intensity grazing?
No. So some will strip graze to a certain extent. If the paddock's really big and they don't have the stock numbers to have a reasonable stocking rate, they'll cut it back. And in a lot of the dairy systems, obviously their paddocks are relatively small anyway. But in a broadacre system, they either set up a temporary electric fence and there's usually enough feed in front of them to keep them, respectful of that fence, or they just don't bother. Yep. Anybody else? Yep. Rob?
As tillage radish roots go,
yeah, so that the question was, can the tillage radish punch down through sodic or hostile soil? So that pig tie tillage radish photo was at Simpson. So some pretty heavy, fairly hostile subsoils there, and we've sown it from down south to up north, so it's gone into some pretty heavy clays and some pretty sodic clays as well, and done reasonably well. It is moisture dependent. In autumn or a wet spring, it will mine down further than in a dry time when the soil's really tough to get through, but it will get through it if given a chance and it finds a little channel. So there are some times where it gets to a certain point and can't get any further, but obviously that's where you have a really big compaction layer. Yep.
Any further
That's
questions?
it.
Yeah, Jake, you talked about grain crops, you talked about barley, canola, wheat. Do you have any thoughts on spring sown pulses?
Not as many. I think in a grazing operation, the pulses can be a good addition. Vetch and peas into the spring sown crops, potentially trying a summer active legume in a summer grazing crop. As for harvest, I'm probably relying on the audience a little bit more to tell me whether that's a good idea. I think if you could harvest them early enough, but they would have to get up and get going and pot up pretty quickly, I think, to get a satisfactory harvest. Yeah. I think your grain crops, as in your barley and your trit, are probably much more reliable.